The second hand did not make a sound, but it still managed to fill the room. It moved with the same steady confidence as always, crossing the same numbers it had crossed 1,000 times, as if nothing in the world could interrupt it. The light above the table trembled once, settled, and continued its tired hum. Someone had wrapped a strip of cloth around the shade weeks ago to soften the glare, and now the cloth had browned at the edges, like bread left too close to a fire. A pencil lay beside a folded sheet of paper. The pencil had been sharpened too often. Its painted sides were shaved thin, the wood showing through in pale ribs. A hand reached for it, lifted it, put it down again without writing. The gesture repeated itself, small and automatic, like checking a pocket for something you already knew was there. Beyond the wall, a door opened and closed with the same careful restraint, never allowed to slam. Footsteps passed, paused, retreated. The floorboards gave a familiar complaint under the weight, the same two boards that always complained. And then the building went back to listening to itself. There were other noises too, softer, woven into the silence. The scratch of a match, a breath drawn in through teeth, the distant clink of metal against metal, like someone setting tools in their proper place. A kettle that did not quite boil, only whispered at the edge of it. Somewhere, a radio hissed in a low, patient way, as if it were waiting for someone to decide it was worth turning the volume up. No one spoke for a long time. Not because there was nothing to say, because anything spoken would have to land somewhere, and the room was full of surfaces that didn't want to hold new words. The air felt used. It had the faint odor of damp wool and old ink, of hands washed with harsh soap. It held the residue of earlier conversations, thin, restless fragments that still seemed to float near the ceiling, refusing to settle. A cup sat near the edge of the table, its contents long cooled. A ring of dried liquid clung to the porcelain, the stain of an unfinished pause. A finger traced the rim once, absent-minded, then stopped as if it had been caught doing something childish. The cup was moved a fraction of an inch, aligned with the table's seam, then moved back again. Precision as comfort, order as a kind of prayer. The waiting had rules. You checked the clock without appearing to. You listened for footsteps that mattered, and learned to tell them apart from the ones that didn't. You found work to do that was not really work. Straightening papers, folding and unfolding the same corner, wiping a spot that was already clean. You kept your face neutral in case someone entered suddenly, because an expression could be interpreted, and interpretations were dangerous. A draft slipped in under the door and touched the ankles like cold fingers. Someone shifted in their chair and the wood creaked. The chair settled, and the room settled with it, adjusting to the new arrangement as though it could memorize it. In the corridor outside, there was a brief laugh, quiet, quickly smothered, followed by the scrape of a chair being pulled back. The laugh did not belong here, and that was the problem. It hung for a moment, a wrong note that made the rest of the silence feel more deliberate. The pencil was lifted again. The point hovered over the paper. For a heartbeat, it seemed the hand might commit to a mark, a line, a decision, something that would make the waiting officially become something else. But the pencil returned to the table. The clock continued. Far away, a dull vibration passed through the structure, so faint it could have been imagination, or a heavy vehicle on a distant road, or thunder that hadn't found its voice yet. It was enough to make the water in the cup quiver, enough to make someone glance up, then glance down again as if the movement of their eyes needed permission. The radio hissed, then clicked, then returned to its patient whisper. A breath was released slowly, like a person trying not to be seen breathing at all. The second hand reached the top of the clock face again, and the room, for reasons no one could name out loud, suddenly felt smaller, like whatever was coming had finally begun to press its weight against the door. And there wasn't much time left to pretend it hadn't. A name was written on the board in chalk that never quite came off. Even when someone washed it down, even when water ran in milky streaks and the sponge squeaked against the slate, the letters stayed faintly visible, ghost marks pressed deep into the surface. The room smelled of damp stone and hot dust from the radiator pipes, the kind of smell that clung to uniforms and paper alike. Someone had opened a window an inch to let the air move, but the air didn't move much. It only shifted, as if it didn't want to leave. Outside, the day had the thin brightness of winter, light without warmth. A clerk at the far desk kept turning a page, smoothing it, turning it back, then forward again, hunting for a line he already knew by heart. Each time he did it, he tapped the corner twice with his finger, a habit older than the war and stubborn enough to survive it. Beside him, a stack of forms sat squared perfectly, the edges aligned like a single block. The top sheet was blank, waiting for ink. Someone walked in with a tin of tea. Not enough for everyone, but brought anyway because it was part of the day. The cups were mismatched. One had a crack that had been there so long nobody remembered when it happened. The tea was poured carefully, never filled to the rim, never sloshed as if spilling would invite something worse. There was talk, quiet, controlled, about ordinary things. A man complained about the way his boots had rubbed his heel raw. Another answered with the same tired joke about swapping feet for the day. A third asked if the bread ration had changed again. The question hung, and then someone shrugged as if it didn't matter, even though it did. A pencil scratched a note in the margin of a ledger. The sound was comforting. It meant things could still be recorded. It meant there was still a system to record them in. When the door opened, the room went instinctively still for half a second, then relaxed when it was only a runner delivering a bundle of messages tied with string. The runner's face was flushed from the cold. He stood too straight, like a boy trying to look older than he was. He handed the bundle over and waited, eyes fixed on a point just above the clerk's shoulder, as if not seeing anything in the room would keep him out of it. The messages were taken one by one, the string cut cleanly, the paper unfolded with careful fingers. Nothing in the expressions changed much. That, too, was routine. A cigarette was lit near the window, the flame briefly bright and alive. Smoke curled upward and was immediately pressed flat against the ceiling by the stale air. Someone frowned and waved a hand, not in anger, only in reflex. The cigarette stayed. Everything stayed, the way things did now. Every small habit preserved like a relic because the habits were proof that the world still had edges. Across the room, a map was pinned to a board, its paper wrinkled from being rolled and unrolled too often. Pins marked positions, routes, lines drawn in pencil, and then erased and drawn again. The map looked like a thing that had been touched too much, worried at, like a wound. Someone stood near it with hands clasped behind his back, not studying it so much as standing in front of it, as if his body could block whatever lay on the other side. He wasn't an officer, not by posture. His shoulders carried the dull droop of someone who had been awake too long. He watched the map the way a man watches a pot that refuses to boil, half expecting it to suddenly change if he looked away. A voice drifted in from the corridor, a familiar one, speaking about timing, about supply, about a delay that would likely clear by evening. The words were calm. The tone suggested confidence. It suggested that if everyone kept moving through their tasks, if everyone kept the day behaving like a day, then the larger machine would behave too. Somebody in the room repeated the corridor voice's reassurance almost word for word, like a charm. By evening, he said. It'll clear by evening. Another man nodded. It always does. That was the kind of optimism that survived here. Small, stubborn, based on repetition. The belief that because something had happened a certain way before, it would happen that way again. The belief that patterns were promises. A telephone sat on a side table, heavy and black. It had the look of an object that could change the temperature of a room with a single ring. For long stretches, it did nothing. When it did, people stared at it as if it were an animal deciding whether to bite. But today, it was silent, and the silence felt like permission to keep pretending. A woman, hair pinned back, sleeves rolled, kept a list of times on a sheet of paper, adding small marks next to each entry. Every so often, she checked the wall clock, then wrote again. The list was neat. The marks were neat. The neatness was not for beauty. It was for control. A way of saying, minutes can be counted. Minutes can be held. At another desk, a man cleaned his glasses with the same square of cloth, even though the lenses were already clear. He did it slowly, methodically, as if polishing could make the air itself more transparent. He set the glasses on his nose and blinked at the room, then took them off and started again. Through the cracked window, distant engines could be heard. Low, layered, fading in and out like a tide. Nobody reacted to that sound anymore. It was just part of the world now, the way wind had been part of the world before. The mind filed it away as background because if it didn't, it would never rest. A metal tray clattered somewhere in the building. Someone cursed softly, then apologized. then cursed again under his breath, quieter this time. The runner still hadn't left. He stood by the door, waiting for a response that wasn't coming yet. His eyes flicked to the map and away again. He shifted his weight, and the floor creaked. He froze, as if even the floor's complaint might be taken as a signal. The clerk at the far desk finally took the top blank form and wrote a date in the upper corner. The ink went down dark, confident. He paused before writing anything else, letting the date sit there alone for a moment, as if it were the first crack in a shell. Across the room, someone laughed again, quiet, automatic, the laugh of a man repeating a joke he'd heard too many times but didn't know what else to offer. It died quickly. A silence followed it that felt heavier than silence should. Then, very softly, as if to avoid alarming anyone, a new sound joined the room's routine noises, a faint tapping from somewhere deep in the building, repeated at intervals too even to be random. A few heads turned, then turned back, like people refusing to acknowledge a thought. The woman with the time list hesitated with her pencil in the air, listening. Her hand made a small, involuntary mark on the paper, a slight slash that did not belong to any time. She stared at it, then carefully crossed it out, as if erasing the mistake would erase what caused it. The corridor voice returned, closer now, still calm, still speaking about schedules and supplies and the comfort of by evening. The words flowed into the room like warm water, smoothing the surface of worry. But the tapping continued, patient and precise. And somewhere in the building, a door that was usually kept closed clicked open and stayed that way, letting a thin line of colder air creep in, air that smelled faintly of oil and wet earth, as if something outside had shifted its position and was now leaning toward them. Time kept moving and everyone kept doing what they did, because if you stopped, even for a moment, you might hear what the routine was trying to cover up. It began with things that did not demand attention. A report arrived missing a signature. The clerk noticed, frowned, and set it aside in a separate pile the way he always did. The separate pile was not large enough to worry about yet. Someone would sign it later. Someone always did. He returned to his work without mentioning it, trusting the rhythm that had carried them through worse shortages of ink, paper, and sleep. The tapping sound returned, closer this time, though still faint. It followed no alarm pattern anyone recognized. 3 taps, a pause, 2 more, then nothing. A man near the door tilted his head listening, then shrugged as if to himself. Old pipes, he mouthed, though no one had asked. Old pipes explained many things here. They were blamed for knocks, for rattles, for moments when the walls seemed to breathe. A runner crossed the room again, different from the first, older, slower. He handed over a single sheet instead of a bundle. The paper was creased as if it had been folded and unfolded too many times in too few minutes. The clerk read it once, then again, then set it face down. He did not add it to the pile. He slid it beneath a ledger instead, where it disappeared completely. "Anything?" someone asked casually, the words stretched thin with effort. "Nothing new," the clerk answered, and the room accepted that answer because it wanted to. At the map, one of the pins leaned at a slight angle. It had probably been that way all day, or maybe it had shifted recently, the cork beneath it giving way a fraction. A hand reached out, straightened the pin, pressed it more firmly into place. The action was precise, almost tender. The hand lingered for a moment longer than necessary, as if waiting for the map to respond. It did not. The telephone clicked once. Not a ring, just a sound, small and mechanical, like a throat being cleared. Several people looked at it. No one moved. After a second, the line went quiet again. Someone exhaled, a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. A note was passed from desk to desk. It contained a single sentence written in a careful, cramped hand. The sentence was read, nodded at, and passed on. By the time it reached the far side of the room, the paper was warm from fingers. It was folded neatly and placed in a pocket, not to be referenced again. The woman with the time list added another mark. The pencil hesitated before touching the paper, then committed. She checked the clock twice afterward, as if to confirm the minute had behaved properly. The clock did not contradict her. It never did. Through the cracked window, the engine noise shifted. It did not grow louder, it spread. The sound layered itself, one note beneath another, until it became harder to separate from the building's own hum. A man muttered something about traffic patterns. Another nodded and added a detail that sounded technical enough to close the subject. A cup tipped and spilled a thin line of tea across the table. The liquid crept toward a stack of papers. Hands moved quickly, too quickly, mopping it up with a cloth that had already been used for this purpose once today. The stain remained, a faint amber shadow. The papers were rearranged to hide it. No harm, someone said. No harm, someone else agreed, without looking. In the corridor, footsteps broke into a brief run, then slowed abruptly to a walk. The transition was awkward, like someone remembering where they were supposed to be. When the person entered the room, his face was composed, his pace measured. Only his eyes betrayed the effort it took to appear that way. He delivered his message quietly, leaned close so only one person heard, and then left without waiting for a reply. The person who received the message stood still for a moment after the door closed. He adjusted his collar. He picked up a pencil, then set it down. He did not share what he had been told. Instead, he asked a question about supplies that had already been discussed twice that morning. The answer came easily. The routine absorbed the interruption. A distant vibration passed through the floor, stronger than before. The metal legs of the desk sang softly in response, a thin ringing that died almost as soon as it began. Someone laughed under their breath and blamed the trains. There were no trains nearby, but the explanation felt solid enough to stand on. At the map, a new line had been drawn in pencil. It was subtle, barely darker than the paper beneath it. It changed very little, but it changed something. A man noticed it, traced it with his finger, and then erased a section, smudging the graphite until it became a gray blur. He stepped back, as if distance might clarify the meaning. The tapping sound came again. This time it was joined by a faint echo, as though the building were answering itself. "Do you hear that?" someone asked lightly, testing the idea as if it were a joke. "Probably nothing," came the reply, too quick. The clock's second hand continued its quiet sweep. Another minute passed. The woman with the list marked it down, then paused. She looked at the paper, at the sequence she had been building since morning, and frowned, not in fear, but in confusion. The spacing felt wrong. The rhythm of the marks had shifted. She almost said something. Instead, she straightened the page and wrote the next time carefully, aligning it with the others. The room settled again, but it did not fully return to its earlier calm. Something thin and persistent had slipped beneath the routine, like grit under a boot. Every step still worked. Nothing had failed, yet, and the waiting, which had once felt passive, now seemed to be leaning forward, quietly, insistently, toward something no one was ready to name. The light changed without anyone touching it. Clouds slid across the sun outside, thinning the brightness until the room took on a flatter, duller tone. Edges softened. Corners seemed to retreat. Someone reached up and turned the lamp's knob a fraction, then another fraction, until the glow returned to what it had been. Close enough. Close was the standard now. A messenger arrived with mud still wet on his boots. He stopped just inside the doorway and waited to be noticed. Posture straight, chin lifted. No one acknowledged him immediately. Papers were finished, cups adjusted, a sentence allowed to reach its end. Only then did a hand gesture him forward. He spoke in a low voice. Not urgent, not calm, controlled. The words moved from one person to another not as sound but as a change in posture. A shoulder tightened, a jaw set, someone's fingers stilled on the edge of the table. When the message ended, there was a brief silence, long enough for the building to creak, long enough for the clock to advance twice. "Understood," someone said finally. The messenger nodded and left. His boots left two dark prints on the floor that no one wiped away. At the map, two men stood closer than before, their heads inclined. One pointed not directly, but with the back of his pencil, tracing the air just above the paper. The other listened, eyes fixed, face unreadable. When the pencil stopped moving, neither spoke. They simply remained there as if waiting for the map to respond. A chair scraped back suddenly. The sound was sharp, too loud for the room. Everyone flinched, then pretended they hadn't. The man who had moved the chair cleared his throat and sat again, more carefully this time. The telephone clicked. Once. Twice. No ring followed. Someone crossed the room and lifted the receiver anyway, holding it near his ear without fully committing. He listened, nodded once, and replaced it gently, as if the object might bruise. He did not explain what he had heard. He asked instead whether anyone had seen the earlier report. the one that needed a signature. "It's here somewhere," the clerk said, already searching. The paper was found beneath the ledger, slightly curled at the edges now. It was placed back on the table, smoothed flat. A pen hovered over the line where a name should go. The pen did not touch the paper. Through the window, the engine noise shifted again. It had direction now. It moved with purpose. Someone remarked on the weather, how the clouds were thickening faster than expected. Another replied that forecasts had been wrong all week. The exchange ended there, tidy and unchallenged. A vibration ran through the floor, longer this time. The desks answered with a low, collective murmur. A cup rattled against its saucer. Hands steadied it instinctively, too late to prevent the sound. No one laughed. The woman with the time list stopped writing. She checked the clock, then the list, then the clock again. The seconds felt uneven. She pressed her pencil harder than necessary when she marked the next minute, the graphite biting into the paper. In the corridor, voices overlapped, brief, hushed, purposeful. A door opened and closed. Another door remained open. The cold air crept farther into the room now, carrying with it a smell that did not belong inside. Fuel, metal, damp earth. It settled low near the floor, unnoticed at first, then impossible to ignore. Someone stood and stretched, a gesture meant to appear casual. "Shouldn't be long now," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. No one contradicted him. At the map, a pin was removed. Just one. It left behind a small, clean hole. The pin was set carefully on the table beside the board, aligned with the edge. The empty space where it had been looked wrong, exposed. A hand reached for another pin. It stopped halfway. Across the room, the pen finally touched the paper. The signature was quick, practiced. The name filled the line completely, leaving no room to add anything else. The document was folded once, then again. The act was so ordinary it almost passed unnoticed. Almost. Outside, the engine noise swelled, then steadied, settling into a constant presence. Inside, the routines adjusted around it, bending without breaking. And in that narrow space between action and restraint, between knowing and admitting, time seemed to hesitate, as if waiting to see whether anyone would speak before the window finally closed. The change announced itself through absence. A task that usually required confirmation did not receive it. The form moved from one desk to another and then stopped, resting in a place it had never rested before. No one commented. The pause was brief enough to feel intentional, as if the confirmation had already happened somewhere else, and simply failed to echo here. A door closed softly down the corridor. It was not slammed. It was not hurried. It closed with care, and the click of the latch sounded final in a way that made several people look up at once. They exchanged glances, then looked away, embarrassed by the instinct. The cold air stopped moving. It settled, heavy and still, as though the building itself had decided to hold its breath. The smell of fuel deepened. Someone noticed it and frowned, then dismissed the thought before it could grow into a question. There were explanations for smells. There were explanations for everything, if you did not demand them too quickly. At the map, the second pin was removed. No announcement accompanied the action. The man did it quietly, lifting the pin free and setting it beside the first. Two small holes now marked the paper, close together like paired punctures. The map did not tear. It accepted the change without resistance. The hand that had hesitated earlier did not hesitate this time. A new line was drawn, thin and light, skirting the edge of a shaded area. The line was not dramatic. It did not cut across anything. It merely adjusted a boundary by a margin small enough to defend if anyone asked. When the pencil lifted, a smear remained where the graphite had pressed too hard. The man rubbed it with his thumb, softening the mark until it blended into the background. "That should do it," someone said. No one asked what it was. The telephone rang, just once. The sound was sharp enough to slice through the room, leaving a clean silence in its wake. Everyone froze. The receiver was lifted immediately this time. No hesitation, no testing. The man who answered spoke only 2 words, both neutral, both useless to anyone listening. He replaced the receiver slowly, aligning it perfectly in its cradle. "It's fine," he said. The word landed badly. It lay on the table between them, exposed. The woman with the time list looked up. For the first time since morning, she did not write. She held the pencil suspended in the air, listening, not for a sound, but for permission. When none came, she lowered the pencil and drew a straight line beneath the last entry. The list was complete. A runner entered, then stopped short, as if he had stepped into the wrong room. He glanced around, uncertain. Someone nodded at him. He relaxed slightly and handed over a message sealed with wax. The seal was unbroken. It should have been broken earlier. The delay was obvious, but unremarked upon. The wax cracked cleanly. The message was read. Nothing in the room moved while it was being read. When the paper was folded again, the man who held it placed it inside his jacket instead of on the table. The gesture was small. It changed everything. Outside, the engine noise reached a steady, unmistakable rhythm. It no longer ebbed. It no longer wandered. It held its place like a presence that had arrived and decided to stay. The sound pressed against the walls, not violently but persistently, the way a tide presses against a shore it has already claimed. Someone cleared his throat and began to speak, then stopped. He tried again, quieter. "If we're going to—" He didn't finish. He smiled faintly, as if amused by his own interruption, and shook his head. "Later," he said. "We'll sort it later." Later slid easily into the room. It always did. A chair was moved closer to the table. Another was angled slightly away. The arrangement of bodies shifted, subtle as the repositioning of furniture in a familiar house. Nobody sat where they had been sitting at the start of the day. The old configuration had dissolved without ceremony. The clerk gathered the remaining unsigned forms and stacked them together. He did not carry them to the next desk. He placed them in a drawer and closed it. The drawer locked with a soft, definitive sound. The key was turned once, then returned to its hook. A vibration rolled through the floor again, stronger than before, and this time it did not fade quickly. The desks sang in response. The windows shuddered in their frames. Someone reached out and steadied the glass, though it did not threaten to break. No one spoke. The map was rolled halfway up, then stopped. The pins remained on the table, aligned neatly. The exposed portion of the map showed only empty space now, the kind that invited interpretation. The rolled edge curled slightly, refusing to lie flat. At the door, the runner waited to be dismissed. He was not. After a moment, he backed away on his own and left. The door did not reopen after him. A clock somewhere deeper in the building struck the hour. The sound was muffled, late, as if the clock itself were struggling to keep up. The wall clock in the room lagged by several seconds before following suit. The two sounds did not align. That was when the feeling changed. Not abruptly, not dramatically. It was the quiet certainty that a sequence had completed itself without announcement, that a step had been taken that could not be stepped back from, not because it was wrong, but because it had already been absorbed into the day's shape. The pen that had signed the paper earlier was capped and set aside. The man who had signed did not look at it again. The cold air returned, creeping in from the corridor, carrying the smell of movement and metal and distance closing. It reached the center of the room and stopped, as if it too had found its place. No one said it was too late. No one needed to. The routines continued, thinner now, stretched over a momentum that no longer waited for agreement. And in the space between the next breath and the one after, the room crossed a line that did not exist on any map, leaving only the faint impression of where it used to be. The room grew quiet in a way that was different from before. Not the practiced quiet of work, not the attentive quiet of waiting for instruction, but a deeper stillness that seemed to come from underneath everything else, like a pause in the earth itself. Even the building's small complaints, its ticks, its distant groans, fell away as if they had been gently pressed down. Someone noticed the silence and shifted in his chair. The movement sounded too loud. He adjusted again, slower, until the chair stopped responding. After that, no one moved unless they had to. The wall clock continued to mark the seconds, but its authority felt weakened. The sound of it no longer organized the room. It merely existed, one noise among many that had lost their usefulness. A man glanced at it and then looked away, unsettled by how little comfort it offered now. Outside, the engines held their position. They did not advance. They did not retreat. They remained, a low, constant pressure against the air, like hands resting on a door that had not yet been pushed open. The sound no longer shifted or layered. It had resolved into something steady, inevitable, a presence that did not require attention to be felt. At the table, a document was unfolded again, then folded back exactly as it had been before. The man handling it did not reread it. He only checked that it was still there, that it had not somehow changed while no one was looking. Satisfied, he slipped it back into his jacket and buttoned it closed. The woman with the time list set her pencil down. The graphite had worn flat at the tip. She turned it in her fingers once, considering whether to sharpen it, then decided against it. There was no reason. The list was finished. Any further marks would belong to a different kind of record. A draft brushed across the floor and lifted the corner of a loose sheet of paper. The paper fluttered, hesitated, and settled again. No one reached to secure it. It felt unnecessary, almost inappropriate to interfere with such a small, honest movement. Somewhere in the building, a bell rang once, and then stopped. No follow-up, no explanation. A man near the window leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the sill. He did not look outside. He watched the glass, the way it reflected the room back at itself. Faces doubled faintly, features softened, expressions suspended between intent and distraction. In the reflection, everyone looked as though they were waiting to be told what they were seeing. Breathing became noticeable. Not labored, not fast, just present. The soft rise and fall of chests, the quiet release of air through noses and parted lips. It was the sound of people trying to remain exactly as they were, afraid that any change might be interpreted as a signal. The map remained half-rolled. No one finished the motion. No one unrolled it again. The pins lay untouched where they had been aligned earlier, their metal heads catching the light in small, dull flashes whenever someone shifted. They looked less like tools now and more like evidence. A hand reached toward one of them. It stopped short, hovering, then withdrew. The telephone did not ring again. Its silence felt deliberate, as if it had said everything it needed to say. The receiver sat heavy in its cradle, aligned perfectly, patient. In the corridor, footsteps approached and then slowed, adjusting their pace before reaching the door. The door opened a fraction, enough for a voice to pass through. Quiet, controlled, stripped of urgency by discipline rather than confidence. "Yes," the voice said. Nothing else followed. The door closed. That single word settled into the room and stayed there, unanswered. It did not clarify anything. It did not resolve what had been building all day. It only confirmed that the sequence was continuing as planned, whatever the plan had become. A vibration rippled through the floor again, deeper than before. The windows responded with a faint tremor. Dust slipped from the corner of a beam and drifted down, slow and delicate, visible in the light for just a moment before disappearing. No one reacted. There was nothing left to react to. The man at the table checked his watch. He did not adjust it. He did not compare it to the wall clock. He simply noted the position of the hands and let his arm fall back to his side. The watch felt ornamental now, a reminder of a system that had already handed control to something else. The air grew colder, not sharply, gradually, as if the temperature were being lowered in careful increments, giving everyone time to accept it without complaint. The smell of fuel and metal was stronger now, unmistakable, no longer something that could be explained away by distance or imagination. Someone opened their mouth to speak. They closed it again. The moment passed unnoticed by anyone except the person who had almost filled it. Chairs remained where they were. Papers stayed stacked. Cups went untouched. The room held its shape with the stubbornness of a photograph, every object fixed in place by an invisible pressure. Outside, the engines shifted pitch, only slightly, just enough to signal readiness. Not movement, readiness. Inside, the last routine completed itself. A final glance at the door, a final check of the table, a final breath drawn a fraction deeper than the others. Nothing followed. The room did not empty. The room did not change. It simply waited, balanced on the narrow edge between now and what came next, suspended there as time stretched thin enough to hold, and then stopped, just before it broke.